The Secrets of Star Trek is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
You're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, episode 61.
Captain to bridge. Spock here.
Make it so. Surrender is not an option.
Attention crew of the Enterprise, this is James Kirk.
We are all explorers, driven to know what's over the horizon, what's beyond our own shores.
We would have helped you get home if you had asked. That's who Starfleet is.
Howdy, all. Father Corey Stika. Different voice beginning this podcast this week because I've been given command of the space station. I mean, Dom is off on a little bit of a vacation, very much needed vacation this week.
On Risa with his family. Yes. Risa's gone very family friendly now, kind of like Las Vegas did for a while.
Yeah, exactly. They say they can make some more money doing that. Obviously, I'm not alone. As you can hear, Jimmy is with me. How's it going, Jimmy?
Going just fine.
This is actually a good opportunity for us because, of course, we're fans of Star Trek and have been fans of Star Trek for a long time. But there's another science fiction series out there that we both enjoy that Dom isn't as familiar with, although I think hopefully after listening to this episode, he'll get started binge watching it.
Yeah.
And that's Babylon 5. And, you know, for those of you who know Babylon 5, you're going, no, wait a second, that Babylon 5 is a lot like Deep Space Nine. And yeah it kind of is. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But we thought, as we were discussing this with Dom, that this would be a good time to maybe do a comparison of the two series, because there are a lot of similarities. But just kind of starting, first of all, with the kind of the behind the scenes of these two series, Babylon 5 was developed by J. Michael Straczynski and produced by Warner Brothers. And the pilot first aired in 1993, but the rest of the series, 5 seasons worth, didn't open until 1994. So it had the pilot movie, and then there was a bit of time before the season start. And it's one of those interesting series because, as J. Michael Straczynski himself said, Babylon 5 has always been conceived as fundamentally a 5-year story, a novel for television, which makes it very different as well. So it's kind of a thing now where all these series have long-going arcs, and they're developed for a couple of years. That was fairly new for television at the time.
Yeah, B5 was the show that really introduced that into mainstream television. You'd had kind of two sorts of shows that all shows were designed to be run forever. You really didn't have, you had miniseries like some of those James Clavell novels got adapted into miniseries, or Rich Man, Poor Man in the 70s, but those were just a few episodes. They weren't designed to run for multiple years, and anything that was designed to run for multiple years either hit the reset button at the end of every episode, like most sitcoms, so there's no real development over the course of the series, or if it was a soap opera, it would have ongoing storylines, but there wasn't an end point that the whole series was working towards. So B5 was new in that, okay, this is a limited series, but it's longer than a miniseries.
Correct.
And we're heading somewhere that's going to put the definitive period at the end of this sentence.
Exactly. After 5 years, assuming that they wanted to renew it, he would have said, no, the story's done. We've told the story.
That's basically what happened. And they said, but I have this other series we could do that's set in the same universe.
Right. That really wasn't that successful, unfortunately. But I think this is more common for like British television, though, to do something like this, where they will do a series in this way, where it'll be like 1 season or 2 seasons, and that's it. It doesn't get extended. Now, switching over to Deep Space Nine, this was developed by Rick Berman and Michael Piller, who were both involved with TNG, Star Trek Next Generation, produced by Paramount in the Star Trek universe, of course. Its pilot first aired in January 1993, so a month before Babylon 5. But the pilot was the first episode of the season, and of course it went 7 seasons from 1993 to 1999.
Yeah.
Deep Space Nine is interesting, and I wonder if we'll have to talk about this, but I wonder if Babylon 5 influenced Deep Space Nine in this way, where it started out more episodic.
Mm-hmm.
There was kind of the overarching story and everything, just the behind the scenes story, so to speak. But it was a typical episodic format with some major themes that were played out. But eventually it moved more to the story arc format like Babylon 5 when you look at the Dominion War.
Yeah. Originally it was planned to basically be Star Trek set on a space station. So whereas the original Star Trek series and Next Generation, you could think of them as Gene Roddenberry did as Wagon Train to the Stars.
Yep.
What Wagon Train was, it was a Western that was about a wagon train bringing people from one place in the East out West. Yep. And you had certain recurring characters who were the main people driving the wagon train, but then you had the guest cast that they would be interacting with who were like travelers on the wagon train. And so the original series and Next Gen were both they were never heading to a destination, but they were traveling from place to place,
right,
with our regulars interacting with guest cast. Deep Space Nine, by comparison, is more like Gunsmoke. Gunsmoke is set in one town. It's in Dodge City. We've got our regulars, and then we have travelers coming through the town, interacting with the sheriff and Miss Kitty and Festus and everybody. And so that's essentially the model for Deep Space Nine. Here's our Dodge City. We've got, Captain Sisko. He's the sheriff. He's the Matt Dillon one.
Yep.
And then we even have Quarks running the equivalent of Miss Kitties.
Yep.
And then we have travelers coming through as the guest cast. But there's no end point required. There wasn't an end point to Gunsmoke. And originally it wasn't envisioned that there was going to be an end point to Deep Space Nine. They had an idea, okay, Next Gen, we're thinking it's going to run for 7 series or so, and so we're going to try to do that here. But they didn't have an overarching story, really, I don't think, until Ira Steven Burr took over as showrunner and started giving it that.
Yeah, some like 3rd or 4th season when they started moving towards the Dominion War storyline and everything in the PA race and all that. And of course, we'll talk about them in a little bit as well.
We should, though, back up and talk about how the shows got started, how the original pitches worked.
Yeah, actually, I was just going to ask, what would be a pitch that you would give for like Babylon 5 if you were to go to the suits and promote it?
Well, it's basically the United Nations in space. You've got this meeting of different alien races at this one location to try to prevent war.
Right.
That's the base. And it's just like the United Nations was formed after a huge war. Babylon 5, the Babylon Project, was established after a huge war to prevent another one. And Straczynski has talked about how he got the idea for Babylon 5, and it predates by quite a number of years Deep Space Nine.
Right.
This is one of the things that led to plagiarism charges.
Yep.
Because what happened was Straczynski had been a successful showrunner for other programs, notably Murder, She Wrote.
That's right.
And had also done some science fiction. He did a show called Captain Power. He got his start writing in animation for The Real Ghostbusters. And he kind of worked his way up the Hollywood ladder to being a showrunner. And he wanted to do science fiction. And he had a couple of ideas for a series. One of them involved kind of like a trading post. And one of them involved empires rising and falling. And as he tells the story, he was in the shower one day and the two ideas collided in his head and he realized this is one story. I can use the trading post outpost thing as the way of telling the story of the empires rising and falling. And so that coalesced in his mind in the shower, and he immediately got out and started writing a bunch of notes that became the basis of Babylon 5. And he always planned it to do what it did, which was give us this space station that's basically the United Nations, and then get us into a war so it fails in its mission.
Right.
But then it leads to something better and greater over time. And so you have the empires rising and falling and a new stable situation after the war. But he realized he could never sell that as an idea to a network. No network is going to buy this 5-year novel for television because every series is open-ended at this point.
Right.
And so what he did now, if you've ever watched the pilot for Babylon 5, The Gathering, one of the recurring themes in it is everybody lies. And so he took that to heart in writing the series Bible for Babylon 5. I have a copy of the series Bible, and so it's like what was given to the network suits to tell them what this series is about. And it basically kind of describes the first season of the show, but one of the points he makes in the Bible is that, or writer's guide to use the more formal term for it, is that there's always going to be these rumors about a big war starting that it's Babylon 5's job to prevent, and the war never actually starts. And it's like he knew that was totally false. That was going to change in the second season. Yeah. But he couldn't tell the networks that was going to happen in the second season. And so he explicitly denied that the war was ever going to start in the series pitch.
Right.
He then spent 5 years shopping it around. So this is like mid-'80s when he's starting to do this. He spent 5 years shopping the series around to different networks, including Paramount.
Gee, who do we know that is run by Paramount? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The Star Trek people work there. And so even though the Babylon 5 pilot aired a month after the Deep Space Nine pilot, Babylon 5 had actually been pitched to the Paramount suits several years earlier.
Right.
And given the similarities between the two series that we're going to talk about, J. Michael Straczynski immediately suspected some kind of plagiarism.
Correct.
And now he eventually concluded that he doesn't think that the original showrunners for Deep Space Nine were in on the plagiarism. He thinks that they were just pitching a similar idea, but given the kind of uncanny similarities, he thinks that the suits at Paramount remembered the Babylon 5 pitch and kind of steered Deep Space Nine to be more like Babylon 5 than it otherwise would have been.
Exactly.
And then once the series were both on the air, he suspected further copying between the series because he was telling his pre-plotted war story, and then Babylon 5 starts its war story that's very similar, empires rising and falling, and it's the first time that's ever been done on Star Trek. And he subsequently said that at Babylon 5 they felt like, okay, we're doing our thing here, and then a year or two later B5 picks it up out of the dumpster and does it again.
Yeah.
And so he felt like both at the inception of the show and as the shows developed, there was some copying on the Deep Space Nine part of what he was doing with Babylon 5.
Exactly. And he did say that he didn't blame, Berman and Piller. He says, you can imagine the way the pitch would have gone where, they go to suits there in Paramount and say, Star Trek Next Generation is doing well. We're showing it all over the world and you're making lots of money off of it. We want to do another Star Trek series. And the suits immediately go, we've got an idea for you, and it's that kind of thing, where maybe the idea of doing it as a space station initially for this second Next Generation series wasn't part of the initial pitch, but it did become part of it really quickly.
Yeah, and I don't know, that may have been part of it. How can we do it different than just another ship flying through space? Well, let's try a space station or a planet or something. But then, let's give it a name with a number in it. Babylon 5, Deep Space Nine.
Yeah.
And let's put this big special effecty wormhole right next to it.
Yes.
We won't call it a jump gate. We'll call it a wormhole.
Wormhole. Yep.
And let's make it a cross section for all these different cultures. And it's in the wake of a war, and it's trying to prevent more wars and stuff like that.
Now, both series were in syndication. DS9 was not tied to any particular network. That's Voyager when they decided to play that game. But Warner Brothers picked up Babylon 5 as kind of the flagship for their Prime Time Entertainment Network, P10.
P10, yeah.
Which that sounds so 1990s of a title. But it became kind of the flagship for that series. And again, Paramount thought, hey, this is a great idea. We want to have our UPN. Let's use Voyager for that. That worked out well. So there's actually an article out there Jimmy found, kind of interesting, called Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5, Remarkably Similar or Similarly Remarkable. And it's very interesting that the parallels, and we're going to kind of discuss some of those. because there are a lot of parallels, some of which are, by the necessity of the format, if you will, the science fiction and kind of the popular tropes, some of them because it's military and some of them coincidental, quote unquote. Now, it's interesting if you look at the in-universe time for each of these series. Babylon 5 in-universe time is 2258 to 2262, which is actually roughly equivalent to Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Next Generation.
Really almost exactly the same time as the original series.
DS9, of course, is like 100 years later, 2369 to 2375. But of course, that's because it's a spinoff from Next Generation, which was before that. So not a shock, since there are two series named for space stations. They're both based on a space station outside of Earth's solar system, managed by an Earth-based government. It's a major point of commerce, important point of interstellar travel in both military and civilian populations. So a lot of similarities there. And it's, like you said, Jimmy, it's very much, this is, I think, where J. Michael Straczynski kind of went, okay, wait a second here.
Yeah, I pitched this to these guys.
This sounds very familiar.
We should have probably a link to this article in the show notes for people if they want to read it, because it has a lot of parallels that we won't be able to talk about here.
Exactly.
Some of the parallels are ones that developed over the course of time, and I don't think they really go to the core of the question of how much borrowing there was. I think some of them are just parallel invention. Some of them are just coincidence. Like one of the parallels they note is both series have a everyman character whose name starts with M.I. So you've got the everyman Miles O'Brien on Deep Space Nine and the everyman Michael Garibaldi on Babylon 5. And they are both everyman working class characters, but I don't think the M.I. is. I think that's just coincidence.
Especially since Miles O'Brien was a holdover character from TNG. He came from TNG and was kind of promoted, if you will, to the chief of the station. So that's there are a lot of coincidences in here. And
I don't think they're all significant, but some of them are significant.
Well, in some of these that I mentioned here, where you've got the military and civilian population, it's a major point of commerce, point of interstellar travel. That's a trope in science fiction, anyways. That you're going to have a station that's this major point of commerce and so on, because it's it's just taking again, using the Old West analogy, like a town
like Fort Apache or something.
A railroad depot in the middle of nowhere, Montana, is going to be an important point of commerce because that's where the railroad stops.
That's where the wormhole comes out, or the jump gate comes out.
Exactly. So that's more of a trope than it is an actual. I'd argue a duplication. Now, again, these are military controlled, or at least military-run stations. So, of course, you're going to have a commander. And one interesting thing with Babylon 5 that you don't see so much in Deep Space Nine, although there are some, Deep Space Nine didn't have as much turnover of its major characters as Babylon 5 did.
Oh, yeah. Well, and one reason for that is because Babylon 5 was late getting the go-to-show order, because they aired the pilot, and then it was like a year before they got the go-to-show order. And so a lot of the options had expired for the people who filmed the pilot. They had to recast a bunch of roles. And then at the end of the first season, the lead actor, Michael O'Hare, and we didn't know this for years afterwards until after he died, he developed paranoid schizophrenia and could not continue filming the show. So he had to be replaced.
Exactly. And he played Jeffrey Sinclair. He was the first commander in both the pilot and the first season.
By the way, notice they're both commanders, not captains. When we start out, and then they become captains.
Captains, correct, because then Jeffrey Sinclair's replacement is Bruce Boxleitner playing Captain John Sheridan, and he again, you're moving up the ranks here. Now, talk about John Sheridan, because he is kind of an important figure in the whole story arc, at least as it became, I guess, rewritten once the change was made.
Yeah. So one of the ways that J. Michael Straczynski developed the show, he recognized that in the world of TV production, you could have actors become unavailable for various reasons. Either they weren't working out or some other reason. And given that he wanted to tell a unified story, he didn't want his story thrown off too much if he had to replace an actor. And so he built in what he thought of as trap doors for each actor. So if an actor needs to go away, he pulls the trap door, that character vanishes, and we introduce a new character that can play basically their same function in the story. And so there were actually trap doors for every single one of the characters in the main cast on Babylon 5. Incidentally, that's the role of all the ambassadors' assistants that we have. If any of the ambassadors ever the actor couldn't continue with the series,
right,
you would just have their assistant move up.
Exactly.
And there's even one character who gets double trapped doored. You had in the original pilot, you had Patricia Tallman playing the telepath Lita Alexander. She then couldn't do the series, so they introduce a new commercial telepath, Talia Winters. But then when Talia Winters goes away, they bring back Lita Alexander. And so you have the double trapdoor with her. In the case of the original commander for Babylon 5, Jeffrey Sinclair, he was this wounded war veteran who had a mysterious thing happen to him in the last climactic fight with the Minbari, the race we'd been warring with. He didn't know what happened to him. And over the course of time, it was going to be revealed that there was this, he played a much more significant role in Minbari culture than he even knew. In fact, he's destined to go back in time and become their major religious leader.
Right.
And they actually pulled that off on the show, even though the actor couldn't continue. They managed to pay off that storyline. But then when he needed to go away, they needed a new character who also could be tied to the overarching story in some personal way. And so they brought in his replacement, Bruce Boxleitner, as Captain John Sheridan, who was also wounded because his wife had vanished mysteriously and died in this expedition to another planet that turned out to be of one of the races, the Shadows, who were involved in the upcoming war. So he had personal stakes in the conflict as well.
Right. And of course, it's interesting when we're talking about parallels. There's a parallel between Captain Sheridan and Commander Sisko, where his wife died in the war with the Borg. That's the one where it's backwards.
But he does. We at least starting out, both stations have commanders who were wounded psychologically in a devastating war by an overpowering enemy, either the Minbari in one case and the Borg in the other.
Exactly. And then later on in the 5th season, there's Captain Elizabeth Lockley, who comes in because it's been a while, but Sheridan goes off to fight the war, basically, wasn't it?
Well, Sheridan has fought the war, and he becomes the head of the New Earth Alliance,
that's right.
the Interstellar Alliance. So he's now become a politician, and he would have been replaced by his assistant, Susan Ivanova, but that actress decided at that point to leave the series, and so they brought in a New Earth captain, Elizabeth Lockley.
So this is a good place to transition on to the next character or set of characters and the second in command of the station. And both series have very strong female second in commands.
Strong is an understatement.
Yeah, exactly. Those who are familiar with DS9 are familiar with Major/Colonel Kira. Of course, she gets a promotion throughout the series. In Babylon 5, at least for the first 4 seasons, it's got Lieutenant Commander Susan Ivanova, who I would argue is a very beloved character on Babylon 5 because she's got some really good one-liners and quotes that you can go find on YouTube. She's a funny character. She's a fun character.
Yeah, she has the same kind of abrasiveness that Kira does, but she gets better zingers.
Yeah.
And that's something Straczynski commented on, was that I remember reading back when the show was in production, he commented in the upcoming season, Ivanova will continue to get the best lines.
Oh, yeah. And she's very Russian. Very, very.
Despite her totally American accent.
Yeah,
she's
exactly.
Attitudinally Russian.
Oh, yes. And it makes her a lot of fun. And, again, this is one of these places you wonder if this was a coincidence. Actually, no, Ivanova was not in the pilot, was she?
No, she was one. It was the original character was also a female second in command who was played by Tamlyn Tomita, an Asian actress. And then her option, I guess, expired when they got the series go order. And so the Susan Ivanova character was created. And she eventually gets promoted to captain. And as we said, would have become the commander of the station in the 4th season. But there were some contract negotiations that didn't succeed. And she ended up leaving. Though she's since she's on good terms with the show's creators now.
Yeah, there was a little bit of heartache going on at that moment. So unfortunately, that's Hollywood. There's stuff like that happen. Another, of course, another major character are the doctors of these two two series. So you got Dr. Bashir, Julian Bashir, and then there's Dr. Stephen Franklin. And both are interesting because they both have some backstories that don't really come out until later in the series.
Mm-hmm.
You know, of course, Julian Bashir with his issues with actually being genetically modified despite being illegal. And then Stephen Franklin had a lot of issues with addiction.
Yeah.
In this series. And
which he overcomes.
Yeah, which made him a very interesting character, I think, dealing with that.
That's one of the differences between Star Trek and Deep Space Nine. I mean, between Star Trek and Babylon 5.
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek never shows us, except in the course of a single episode, any kind of addiction. And it's always overcome by the end of the episode. In the Babylon 5 universe, people really do have addiction issues that they can struggle with for years. Mm-hmm. And in fact, two of the characters on Babylon 5 have addiction issues. The first one we learned about is Michael Garibaldi,
right,
who has alcohol issues and became a teetotaler as a result. And he then at one point in the series tragically falls off the wagon at a crucial moment. But then he gets his act back together again. And the other is Stephen Franklin, who falls into addiction through another psychologically plausible reason. It's in the middle of a war. He's a doctor. He's caring for wounded refugees. He needs to stay awake to deal with the refugees. He needs to be at peak mental efficiency. And so he starts taking stimulants or stims so he can function better as a doctor in a crisis situation. And he becomes addicted to the stims.
Yep.
And that's very psychologically plausible. He then has to get off of them. And it's tragic. I mean, when this comes out, he's actually relieved of duty, and is just like, you're not getting back on duty until you have this lick.
Yep.
And he has to go through a journey, and both he and Garibaldi have this play out as a factor in their lives, not just, oh yeah, I got addicted to a video game for an episode and then I got off of it.
Yeah.
And it's more psychologically believable. That's one of the things, and this is something I kind of wanted to mention, is Babylon 5 has a level of realism in certain respects that Star Trek did not have.
Yes.
And this was one of the things back in the 90s that really attracted me to Babylon 5, was the greater degree of realism that the characters were presented with. They were not all perfect, unlike Next Generation, let's say, or which was kind of the apogee of that. Everyone on that show was perfect.
Yep.
And they don't have interpersonal conflicts. It's also the reason that DS9, which started to break that mold, attracted me, because they are more psychologically complex than other Star Trek characters. But Babylon 5 was the one that really started showing characters in a sci-fi context that could do things you could never imagine on Star Trek. There's an episode of Babylon 5, I think it's in season 2 or 3, where you have a character who has a crucial piece of information needed to catch a serial killer that is on the station. And he is not willing to disclose that information. And so what happens is you have the captain, Captain Sheridan, and Michael Garibaldi, the security chief, have him in an interrogation room. He's sitting there. He's like, I'm not telling you guys what you want to know. He's like a Centauri telepath who happened to catch a bit of the thoughts of the killer. So he has information in his head about the killer that they need to stop the killer. And he won't tell them. And so when they realize he will not tell them, Michael Garibaldi pulls out a black bag and puts it over the head of the telepath so he cannot see what's happening. And then a human telepath comes into the room and rips the information out of his brain. And the reason that they have to cover his head is because human telepaths are not allowed to do this. This is against the law. And so they have to shield the human telepath's identity from him. And then the human telepath, it's Lita Alexander, she gets the information out of his head, she leaves the room, they take the bag off of his head, and they go proceed to catch the serial killer. Well, okay, they've just done this flagrantly illegal act to stop a series of murders. You cannot imagine Captain Picard doing this.
No. No, not at all.
It's have Worf put a black bag over someone's head so Troy can come in and rip the information out of their brain. I mean, this would never happen on Next Gen.
And, and I think the closest DS9 ever came to it, at least as far as the Federation doing it, was the episode where they're hunting down Eddington.
Eddington, yeah.
Where Cisco has them launch this torpedo full of some element that's toxic to Cardassians, but it turns out humans can live there because the Cardassians did that to a human plant, and it still worked out okay in the end, where just people had to move planets, basically.
Yeah, the only episode where they do something really equivalent to this is in the Pale Moonlight, where Captain Cisco, even though he's uncomfortable with it, sanctions devious methods that lead to the death of a person in order to get a couple of people in order to get the Romulans on our side in a war.
That's right.
And but that's way after this. That's after Babylon 5 is off the air. So you really have to give Babylon 5 credit with introducing this level of realism and shadiness to the good guys. And even then, you still look at the characters on Deep Space Nine, like Cisco. Yep. And they're still these kind of operatic, semi-perfect people, despite the rough edges. Whereas on Babylon 5, someone like Michael Garibaldi, he's just a broken human being.
Exactly.
Now, I have to say, having given them credit for realism, I don't think going back and rewatching Babylon 5 with modern TV sensibilities, it's clearly a transitional thing. It still has a lot of the operatic, stylized stuff in it, especially in the dialogue and things like that. It feels artificial in a way that later series like the rebooted Battlestar Galactica don't. The rebooted Battlestar Galactica went even farther in the realistic, tarnished humanity, good guys direction. And so you look back at Babylon 5, and it's kind of in the middle. It's not as gritty as Battlestar Galactica, but it's more realistic than Next Generation.
Right. Well, and one thing J. Michael Straczynski wrote is that he was aiming for adult science fiction, at least as he understood it at the time. And he actually put in parentheses, so no Wesley. He purposely called out Wesley Crusher. By the way,
he said anytime we have a kid on the show, the kid is going to, or a cute robot, it's going to die. And actually that happened when we did have some kids on the show and they died.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Apparently he was very active on, if you remember, Genie and CompuServe and AOL during the production of Babylon 5.
I was active in the AOL B5 board when that was happening in the second season. And I was there when he joined that board. And I had just summarized, based on clues in the first season, I had a post where I said, here's what the overall shape of Babylon 5 is going to be, because that was the big guessing game at the time, was where's this all going to go? And I, think in terms of plot mechanics. And so I looked at the clues in season 1 and I said, here's the overall shape of the season. It's going to be a story where the humans and the Minbari have to come together and overcome their internal diversities between the different human groups that don't like each other and the different Minbari castes that don't like each other. And we're going to have to, between those groups, pull together a coalition that is able to challenge the shadows. And unity is going to be the key to the overall solution. And this was before the war had started.
Right.
So I saw the war, I saw all of this. And then Straczynski joins the board the next day and says, I've been reading the board and you guys are amazing. So I don't know that he was referring to my post, but given that I just guessed exactly what was going to happen over the next several seasons, I kind of wonder, that's one of the things he was thinking about.
There's a website, jmsnews.com, where they have archived all those old posts. Anything from, again, Genie, CompuServe, and AOL, where you can go back, and it's fun to go back and look where he's actually producing it, and he's talking about the storylines and everything. So if you want to learn more about Babylon 5 than what we can cover in this podcast, go take a look at that. I mean, it's pretty incredible to get kind of the behind the scenes.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons he was interested. He was deliberately active on the internet on this show in a way he hasn't been on others, and he said he kind of did it as sort of an experiment in showing the public how the sausage gets made.
Mm-hmm.
He was interested in engaging the fan community and pulling back the curtain in a way that it hadn't before.
Right. Well, because there was one post I saw where he talks about how the station is going to be CGI. It's going to be computer generated versus a model. And of course, that is one of the key distinctions for production of Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine's. Babylon 5 was all done on the external views, the space battle views and all that were all done on Amiga computers, which at the time were top of the line computers. Just now they're primitive, but DS9 was still using models basically.
And eventually DS9 did start to use CGI.
But that was much later on.
One thing that I would go back when the B5 was on the air, I would go to Comic-Con here in San Diego, which then was still massive, but it was not what it is today. Today, it's just too overwhelming for me.
Sure.
But I would go, and every year, JMS, J. Michael Straczynski, would have a presentation at Comic-Con because he was from San Diego. He lived here in San Diego. And so he'd come back every year for Comic-Con and have a talk and show an episode that was an upcoming major arc episode that had not been, it wouldn't be aired for a couple of months. And so you get to see where the story was going. It was so awesome. Eventually, the studios forced him to stop doing that because so many people were attending his panel that it's like it became legally a commercial performance.
Oh, sure.
And the contracts didn't allow him to do commercial performances of the show.
Sure.
But I would go, and he talked about, the behind-the-scenes stuff. One of the things he talked about, I remember, was the CGI sets, because he would always be pushing the CGI makers to do better, to make it more realistic and stuff. And he told a story once about how he was reviewing some promotional footage that they had made for the series where, like, Bruce Boxleitner comes out on a darkened stage and there's a ladder and a rope and a light and he's just walking around the darkened stage talking about the show. And the guys who were showing him the footage, so he could approve it so it could be released, said, how does this footage look to you? And he said, it looks fine. You don't see anything wrong with it? Oh, no, it's fine. It's a virtual set, you schmuck. They had punked him with a virtual set to get back at all of the pushing to make it more realistic. Unfortunately, you look at the show now and it really is kind of video game level CGI. It's obvious now that this is CGI.
Yeah, and I mean, assuming the original files are still in existence, which is when it comes to whether movies or whatever, is not always a guarantee. It could be re-rendered on a modern system, made to look much better. But for the time, though, I mean, when this came out, it was pretty mind-blowing for a TV show to have these kind of special effects rendered by computer. It really was incredible at the time. And of course, again, DS9 looked like every, TNG did at the time because they were using the same basic technologies. Going back to the character, we kind of went off track there, but are any other, you mentioned Michael Garibaldi, and of course, you've got that comparison between Garibaldi and Odo, where they're both not quite the same as, shall we say, the higher ups as far as the way they look at the world.
Yeah, they're both security guys. They're both kind of pragmatic and shady in a way that their leaders are not necessarily. The similarities, though, I don't think are overly strong between them because Odo has this. He's a shapeshifter. He's not even a human being,
right?
And Garibaldi is just a guy with a Boston Irish Italian working class background guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's somebody you could find at kind of the corner bar after work having a few. And of course, that's part of his problem, like you mentioned, is he had a little too many of a few.
The only other characters, we've talked about the major points of comparison. We haven't talked about some of the non-human characters.
Right.
So we have, because this is the United Nations, we have representatives of alien races, and there's 4 major races. There are the Centauri, who are basically based on Italians.
Right.
And like Italians, they're inheritors of a rich tradition where they used to have an empire, but they don't anymore.
Right.
And so you have this kind of Mussolini-like thing in their culture where it's like, we're going to recapture our former glory and rebuild our empire.
Right.
And so they start out as these kind of comic characters. You also then have the Narn. The Narn, I don't know if they're based on, they're not really quickly identifiable as any human culture, but basically they are former victims of the Centauri. So they had a primitive technological culture. The Centauri took over their planet. In a way, it's kind of like the Bajorans and the Cardassians. But you could think of the Narn as like former colonials who have now achieved their independence, and now they're feeling their oats. They're being assertive. They want to expand and so forth. And they're kind of the rising threat at the start of the series. You then have the Minbari, who they're based on the Japanese culture. Even looking at them, they're clearly based on the Japanese culture. Their philosophy is modeled after Buddhism and Shintoism, and they Pearl Harbored us a number of years ago. Only they were the ones with the bomb, effectively. Yeah. And they almost wiped us out. They were on the verge of exterminating humanity, and then for mysterious religious reasons, they stopped, and we didn't know why for more than 10 years. And then the final major race is the Vorlons, who are very powerful and very mysterious, and we've never even seen one. Because they wear these, they call them encounter suits that even mask the outlines of what they look like. You can't even tell how many arms this thing has. And they're very mysterious and cryptic and ancient, and that's really all we know about them. Yeah. Over the course of time, as things develop, we have a significant amount of role reversal happening, especially with the Narns and the Centauri. Originally, it looks like the Narns are the rising threat, and they're going to get revenge on the Centauri for colonizing them in the past. And that's not what happens. We have this other ancient race called the Shadows starting to reassert itself. We don't even know about them for the first half a season before we get any clue the Shadows exist. But they're this ancient Lovecraftian race that's starting to reassert itself. And they ally, they have a human representative, very nice guy named Mr. Morden. He goes around to all the ambassadors and asks them a very simple question. What do you want? And he gets a variety of answers. This, incidentally, is something J. Michael Straczynski has a degree in psychology.
Oh, sure.
And one of the things that they would do in certain forms of psychology is ask questions that are hard to answer. The key ones being, who are you and what do you want? Because there's never a good answer to these, and so you can use them to strip away things. You say, well, who are you? Well, I'm Jimmy Akin. Yeah, but who are you? Yeah. And you can, no matter what the person says, you can keep asking that question. Same thing with what do you want? What do you want? Oh, I want pepperoni pizza. No, but what do you want? And you can keep digging for different layers. And so the Shadows question is, what do you want? And Mr. Morden goes around asking everyone what do they want, and he eventually gets Londo, the Centauri ambassador, at a moment where he's feeling vulnerable, and he says, I want it all back. I want the Empire back. And he says, okay, we can do business. And so the Centauri get their Empire back, and the Narns go from being the rising villains to the pitiful victims. And so we have this role reversal where Jakar, the Narn ambassador, who was originally very belligerent and threatening and a lot like a Klingon, ends up becoming a humble spiritual leader who grows through suffering. And meanwhile, Londo, who starts as a comic, drunken ambassador down on his luck character, becomes a sinister, powerful figure who has a tragic redemption story where he has to sacrifice himself in the end. And so you have this change of the roles of the characters that's unlike what we had seen in Star Trek to that point. You knew someone's a Klingon, he's a bad guy. Oh, yeah. Someone, and that's it. We're never going to see Klingons as victims.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's, I think that is one of the attractions of this series is it wasn't static. I think he tried very much to not just have this character is this. Yeah. But there was development of all the characters.
Eventually, we find out that what happens in the galaxy is basically a conflict between the Vorlons and the Shadows. They're members of these ancient races whose job, by mutual agreement, is to shepherd the younger races and help them develop.
Right.
But the problem is they have different philosophies of how to do that. Whereas the shadows ask what do you want, and want to unleash people's desires, which produces chaos in order to force evolution forward. The Vorlons are very structured and law focused. Their question is, who are you?
Right.
And they want to dictate how people should develop. So the Vorlons represent excessive order, the shadows represent excessive chaos, and they're both trying to use their preferred philosophy to force the races or help the races develop, and that leads to conflict.
Right.
With us as caught in the middle between these two ancient races, and we then have to find our way out of the conflict between our elders.
Right. And that's a very different, again, going to our comparison, very different to DS9, where, yes, you've got these ancient races, the wormhole aliens versus the Pa Wraith, but that's more of a localized thing.
Yeah. And when they win the Dominion War, they just do it by military force, which is a fascinating story. But eventually, towards the end of the Shadow War, Sheridan realizes we can't fight our way out of this. There's no way we can compete militarily and win. We can win skirmishes, but we cannot win the war militarily. We have to think our way out of this.
Right.
Which is then where my solution from the beginning of season 2 comes out.
But it's interesting too with Babylon 5. There's much more uproar because there's the Earth government is overthrown, like you said. Sheridan becomes the head of the Interstellar Alliance. The Earth Alliance gets overthrown, basically.
This is one of the things, and it really worked until season 5. In each, Straczynski said, we want to up the stakes in each series, in each season of the show. So the first season is basically learning the world. We have a little bit of character arc. We have a little bit of hints of bigger things to come. Season 2, the war breaks out. Season 3 is the war builds. Things are really going badly. Season 4 was meant to be the end of the war, and season 5 was going to be the aftermath of the war, but it looked like they weren't going to get a season 5. And so they had to take the big wham episodes that would have been in season 5 and pull them forward into season 4.
Sure.
And that made season 5 a little bit of a letdown. But even after they get out of the Shadow War, because the Shadows had taken over EarthGov, we now have as a successor to the Shadow War, which is kind of abstract. I mean, yeah, it's a big war, but it's kind of off in space.
Right.
Now we have a civil war on Earth, and our heroes have to knock over their own government.
Right.
And wow, is that powerful.
It is.
And so that's originally what season 5 was going to be, but they had to pull those episodes forward. But it's still a really powerful story arc to, even after we win the big interstellar battle, now we have to win the battle back home, which is even more personal.
Things aren't settled yet at that point.
Yeah, this would be like we have to defeat the Dominion, and then we have to conquer Earth.
Right, and it's funny because there is one episode, one two-part of DS9 where they talk about this, where there's one of the shapeshifters or a couple of shapeshifters have taken over places in the Federation government on Earth, and interestingly, the same actor is
Robert Foxworthy.
Yeah. He's in both Babylon 5 and DS9 doing the same role as a military leader trying to overthrow the Earth government. Figure that one out.
They were unhappy because he played the Admiral in Babylon 5 first, and then they were bringing him back to do a show, and he said, I can't. I'm doing this similar thing for DS9 now. I'm not available that day.
Yep.
So they killed his character.
Yep, they were done with him.
Introduced. Oh yeah, he got killed amidships when we took a laser blast here a few minutes ago.
Oops. Funny how that happens. So one of the themes we haven't touched on, and of course, is something that's kind of near and dear to our hearts. Both series have a really interesting treatment of religion.
Yeah,
both of them do. And with Babylon 5, it's even more interesting knowing that J. Michael Straczynski is a fairly diehard atheist.
Yeah, he does understand and appreciate religion, even though he's not personally religious. And we see that in a bunch of ways on Babylon 5. Now, in both shows, we have this kind of spiritual race. In Deep Space Nine, it's the Bajorans.
Yep.
And in Babylon 5, it's the Minbari. And in both cases, the commander of the station is a religious figure for them. Captain Sisko is the emissary of the prophets, and reluctantly. Yep. And Jeffrey Sinclair, unbeknownst to him, is Valen, the founder of their religion. But he's also reluctant. He doesn't know that yet. And so you have that element that's the same on both shows. But then you have, because Gene Roddenberry wouldn't let humans be religious overtly in the Star Trek universe, even though you have hints of it with Cassidy Yates is clearly a Christian. You do have overtly religious characters in the Babylon 5 universe. Right. Jeffrey Sinclair, the original commander, was raised by Jesuits on Mars. He is a Catholic. Garibaldi is an agnostic. Not an atheist, but an agnostic.
Right.
Susan Ivanova is Jewish. You have, in the second season of Babylon 5, you have a group of Dominican monks come to the station and become permanent residents there, specifically so they can talk to aliens about religion. They're going to share what God has done with our race, and they're going to learn what God has done with other races. And so they're there for ecumenical interreligious dialogue with aliens.
Right.
And they become regular characters on the show. They're not prominent, but they're there in a bunch of episodes. So we have that. Each of the alien races has at least one religion. Some of them have more than one religion.
Right.
And later, this isn't in Babylon 5 itself, but it's in the same universe. In later years after the show was off the air, they did a series of mini movies.
Right.
M-I-N-I, mini movies that each one is like 20 to 40 minutes long or something like that. They're called Babylon 5, The Lost Tales. They were released on DVD. And in the first one, we have an exorcism. It's a real demon. Now, from J. Michael Straczynski's perspective, demons are some kind of alien or something. Yeah. But he takes seriously the idea of demons and exorcists and stuff. It turns out, this is his theory, his on-show explanation for this. Demons are real, and they are all confined to Earth. Earth is a prison planet for demons. and so this one demon possesses a guy who then travels off Earth. And the demon then manifests himself, and you have fire and all kinds of stuff happening with special effects. And they bring in a priest to deal with the demon. And the demon, as the priest talks to the demon, it's like the demon is going, "Oh, just say the name, say the name." And he's wanting to be exorcised in the name of Jesus.
Yep.
And the priest realizes that's what he wants.
He wants to be set free.
He wants to be set free off of the Earth so he can roam the universe. This is a jailbreak.
Yep.
And so rather than exorcising the guy, they sedate him and send him back to Earth where he can be exorcised in safety.
Yeah, it is very interesting to watch. And you watch, there's all kinds of Earth religions that are shown in one form or another. And it is very interesting. Of course, with the DS9, it was very much the main religion you saw was Bajoran. There might have been hints of other religions.
Klingon. That's
Ferengis with their money.
The founder's religion.
Yeah, Ferengis with their money and things like that. Yeah, that's very much a religion for Ferengis. So, but no, that was very very interesting comparison. And then both series had kind of had shadow structures within the government. Now, of course, we've talked on this on our podcast about Section 31 in Star Trek, which did come out of DS9. That's where we initially heard about it. But Babylon 5 had the Psi Corps in Bureau 13, which was kind of their equivalent. And again, I wonder if this is one of these parallels that got borrowed.
Section 31, Bureau 13.
Exactly. Are there any other themes that you can think of kind of as a comparison?
Those are sort of the major ones. By the way, one thing on the religion subject, there's actually, to give you an illustration of just how different this can be. Now, the exorcism one is a big one, but one that actually happened in the main series itself. there's a point where several religious leaders who are kind of running an underground railroad for telepaths come to Babylon 5. They know Brother Theo, the head of the monks on the station, and there's a rabbi and an imam and a Baptist pastor who are there, Black Baptist pastor who are there. And while he's on the station, he leads a revival service. And we see the revival service, and he's and you have the main characters there, whether they're personally religious or not. They're attending the revival service. They're singing the hymn, and the hymn is one I believe Straczynski himself wrote, because he wasn't always an atheist. He actually was a member of a religious commune for a while, and he wrote some hymns, and I believe this is one of them. But the hymn is called "The Rock Cried Out, No Hiding Place." And so you have this gospel singer there who's, I went to the rock to hide my face, and the rock cried out, no hiding place. And it's this great, energetic, black gospel hymn. It sounds awesome. And as we're seeing the revival happening, we're intercutting with one of the show's villains getting his comeuppance in underground tunnels. He's going to the rock to hide his face, and the rock is not giving him a hiding place.
That's funny. Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to go back and watch Babylon 5. It's been a few years, and I know I enjoyed it. I have to go back and pull them out again. And to be fair, if you haven't watched Babylon 5, I recommend it. I know Jimmy does as well. However, the first season is a little draggy, to say the least.
It has first season-itis, yeah. There are some key episodes in it, but there are others you could skip.
Now, are there any particular episodes, if someone just wants to get a taste of Babylon 5, are there any episodes you could think of off the top of your head that would be good places to start, just to get the feel of it?
So in the first season, and because it's an episodic show, it's hard to just pull things out of later seasons. But in the first season, the first season, first episode, Midnight on the Firing Line, gives you a sense of the political drama and the stakes that are involved. Then later in the first series, the midpoint is an episode called Signs and Portents, where we first meet Mr. Morden. And then the final episode of the first season, The Coming of Shadows, is where things really start to fall off the rails.
Sure.
And then in the second season, I'm blanking on the name of the episode. We could probably put it in the show notes, but it's the one where the Centauri Emperor visits the station and the war actually breaks out. And that is kind of a major early turning point that gives you a sense of where the show's going.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely check that out. There's another site here I've found where the guy's gone through every episode and kind of related how important an episode is to the overall storyline. Anywhere from just don't even bother watching it to core episode, ranking 5 stars, and Voided is 0 stars. It's blank star. And unfortunately there's a few of those where they're kind of weak.
Actually, I have to revise what I said. The end of the first season episode is called Chrysalis, and that's a major turning point episode. And then the one in the mid-second season where the war breaks out, that one is called The Coming of Shadows.
Excellent. So that's worth checking out. Anything else you want to mention about either series or both series?
Well, both series have a certain amount of age to them. They're not quite as fresh. And when you see that in the series depends. Most of it in B5 is in the first season, which is common for series. The first several seasons of Deep Space Nine, I don't think, are that great.
No.
It's not really till the Dominion War kicks off or where they start laying the foundation for the Dominion War that things get interesting on Deep Space Nine. But even later, just to, there are some clunker episodes in Babylon 5. They're not that common, but they're there. One of them is called Gray 17 is Missing. And this is an episode where Garibaldi goes to an undeveloped part of the station, where there is kind of a cult that is running things in this undeveloped kind of part of the station. And they have a rubber suit monster that he needs to defeat. and he defeats it in a way that is completely ridiculous. Earlier in the episode, they have an interesting scene where Garibaldi's talking to one of his assistants, and he's showing him a gun, an actual 20th century gun that he said belonged to like his grandmother when she was on the Boston police force. And the aide is impressed by it. It's like, wow, a slug thrower, something. It doesn't fire little energy packets. It fires actual bullets. And they make the point that, you don't want bullets on a space station because they tend to puncture things and cause explosive decompression.
Yeah.
So that's why they use energy weapons. But he puts the bullets for this thing in his pocket, and then when he's got to defeat the rubber suit monster, he needs to propel the bullets, and so he rips a steam pipe off of the wall and puts the bullets in the steam pipe, and that causes the bullets to fire and defeat the rubber suit monster. And this is like anything about guns, and this is the stupidest thing ever. You need a firing pin to get a bullet to fire. Putting it in a steam pipe is just going to burn your hand. It's not going to do anything for the bullet.
Burn your hand and maybe shoot the entire shell about 10 feet and call it good.
Exactly. So a friend of mine pointed out, okay, so this is J. Michael Straczynski, Hollywood liberal who doesn't know anything about guns, trying to understand things from a gun point of view. And he's trying to give gun owners their props. He just doesn't understand how guns work. It's kind of like in a later episode of Deep Space Nine, you have Quark with this alien talking economics and getting him onto the thrill of capitalism. And the writers clearly don't understand how the free market works.
Exactly.
But they're trying to enter the thought of people who do understand it, and so they get props for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're trying. Well, that's best we can hope for. So
yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That's a good conversation. I hope that brought some interest to people listening about Babylon 5. Again, I agree it's worth watching, so check it out. And thank you again for listening to The Secrets of Star Trek and all our podcasts here at SQPN. We do appreciate all of our listeners, everyone who joins us for these podcasts, everyone who likes and has comments for us. Of course, we want to hear your feedback. You can do that as well. We definitely want to hear what you have to say. We also greatly appreciate those who support us through our Patreon campaign. You can go to sqpn.com/give and click the Patreon link to join our Patreon patrons in their support of SQPN. Because, of course, it does cost money to keep these podcasts going. Even if most of us are volunteers, it still costs money to make sure you can get these podcasts. And this week, I'd like to thank those patrons, Sally H., Gregory F., Darius M., Gary H., and Mike K. Thank you and all of our Patreon supporters and all those who support SQPN. We do greatly appreciate your support and hope you'll continue to share our podcasts with your friends and subscribe, and especially at places like Spotify, where you can find all of our podcasts now. Well, Jimmy, thank you very much for coming on. This was a very enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Father Corey. Live long and prosper. And who are you and what do you want?
Yeah, exactly. And again, Father Corey, thank you for joining us. And remember that Babylon 5 was our last best hope for peace.